Hi, this is Professor Pam with Jumpstart Code, and I am starting a series of videos on functions. So let us jump right into what we're going to do here. We are not going to really build anything to start. I want to really just focus on syntax and what functions are. So we're going to keep the HTML and the CSS very simple. So I've created a project directory over here called Function Practice. In that directory, I have an index.html. All it has is this. It does have a link to a style sheet. All I have there is my standard reset that I start with and just a background color. All right, I've also created my JavaScript file. So remember, extensions are very important. HTML is the extension for your HTML file. You've got .css, and now we have .js for JavaScript. And basically, HTML is the structure, CSS is the styling, JavaScript is action. So we've already previously talked about how we connect a JavaScript file. We put a script tag, and we use source equals the file name, functions.js, and I always like to put an alert to make sure that I am connected. All right, so it looks like I'm good, so I'm going to take that off. Now the other thing that I like to always start with is use strict. And I think in the past I've shown you what that means is it's going to require me to declare all my variables, which is a really good habit to get into using let or const. You'll notice if I try to just use a variable here now without declaring it first, then I get an error message, okay? And speaking of that, we know that with JavaScript, you always want to have your console open so that you can see your error messages. All right, so now we want to talk about functions. So what is a function? A function in JavaScript is basically just a block of code designed to perform a particular task. So I like to think of it as a subcontractor. I want to subcontract this work someplace else. And part of why you do it is because you want to code in smaller blocks. You want to code on very specific tasks. If your code starts getting very, very, very long, then it becomes difficult to debug it. So you need to kind of divide and conquer, and functions allow you to do that. If you are going to use a function in JavaScript, there are two important parts to that. You have to define it, and then you have to use or call it. All right, now when you are going to make a function, the first thing that is very important is for you to make clear what is the job description of this function. So let's say we're going to do a very simple function here. This function's job is going to be to print a hello message. Okay, so in order for it to do that work, do I need to give it anything? If it's always going to print hello, then no, I don't need to provide any information to this function. We're going to see later on, sometimes you do. So then you should give it a very descriptive name. So let's say I'm going to call this function say hello. All right. There are a lot of ways to define functions, but we're going to start with the most fundamental right now. So to define a function, I use the keyword function. Then I give it a name. So I'm going to call it say hello. Actually, I'm going to do like a couple of versions of this. So I'm going to call this one say hello 1. And we need parentheses here because what differentiates a function from a variable is the parentheses there. So this is going to be my function definition. right? Now, let's open our curly brackets. And in here, I'm going to write the work for what is it supposed to do. So this function prints hello to the console, right? So I know how to do that work. Console.log hello. And then this is the end of my say hello function. Now, if I just run this, so I've written that code, but you'll see nothing gets printed to the console. That's because I have defined a function, but I have not used it. I must call it, okay? So here's going to be the start of my program execution. And I know that I'll put console log start here, starting, and we'll see that. Right? So over here, we see starting. So notice, even though this definition is there, we don't immediately go into that code. In order to go into that code, we have to call the function. So when we call this function, we call it by its name, and you must have the parentheses. Now let me show you, suppose we don't put the parentheses there, right? And then I'm going to put another console log at the end here that says done. All right, so interesting. Look at what happened. It said starting, and then it said done. And the problem is there really is an error here, but it's not giving me an error message. Sometimes you get an error message. Sometimes JavaScript just says, I don't know what you mean, so I'm just going to ignore it. But this is not a proper function call. In order to make it a proper function call, we must have the parentheses there, right? So now look at what happens. We printed out the starting, then we called the function. This transferred execution to the function definition. It does whatever work is in the function definition. And then when it's done, it continues back to where it picks up where it left off again, right? And what's useful about a function is that I can call it multiple times. So sometimes if you have some work, a task that might need to be done multiple times, rather than copy and paste and putting that code over and over again in your program, you can write it one time and you can call it multiple times, right? So I can say here, I'm just going to put again, and if I call it here again, all right, so we called it and we called the function again. So this is the most basic syntax to define a function. And again, notice if I want to, I could move the function definition to after all of this code. It doesn't really matter when you use this particular syntax. It doesn't matter where it is, because this code is only called on when you call it, right? It's only activated when you call it. As a matter of fact, I wouldn't recommend this. Actually, I've never tried this, but I think this will actually still work, right? So even if the function definition is in the middle of this code, it still only gets activated when we actually do a call to the function. Now, I would not recommend doing this. What I would recommend is put your function definitions at the very top, just to keep your code very organized, okay? Either that or at the very bottom. Either way, As a matter of fact, I think actually I want to put them so that this way we can see that when the program starts, anything that is outside of a function definition is going to automatically start to be executed, right? But this code only happens if I decide to call on it. All right, so this is a pretty boring function because all it can do is say the exact same thing every time. Functions can have parameters. I can pass information to a function that I want it to operate on. So let's say we're going to make a second version of this function, say hello to, and this function is going to have a parameter called your name. So this function's job, this function prints hello along with a name, right? So this parameter here, I give it a name. I could call it Joe Bob if I want to, but you need to give it a name that is descriptive of what kind of information is supposed to be in there, because you then write this code assuming that there is a value in here. And I'm going to show you in a second how the value gets there. So here, if I want to print this out, if I want to print out hello, then I can use concatenation to put the name, and let's put an exclamation point on the end. All right, now, if I change this to say hello to, okay, well, there was a problem there. Look, it says hello undefined because I did not provide a value when I called the function to be passed into here. So when I call say hello to, I really need to provide a value here, right? So I can say Batman, okay? And now, so the value, this string gets passed into your name when the function is called. And so the value that I get printed out is hello Batman, like this. But why is it all mashed up together like this, right? I put spaces here and spaces here. Why isn't it spaced out? Well, if I want spaces in there, I have to put the spaces, the space here, right? So now we see that. Or I want to show you another way to do this. There's something called a template string, which I really haven't talked about before, but I want to just introduce it here. When you use a template string, you don't use these double quotes. You use the backtick, which is the shift of the key above your tab key. And now I don't have to put all this concatenation in here. I'm actually defining this string. But now if I do this, that's not quite what I want. It says hello and it says your name because it's going to print exactly what's in here. If I want the value of the variable your name, then I have to put a $sign and curly brackets around this. So now I am building a string that has hello, and when it gets to the $sign curly brackets, that means it looks up the value that is in this variable and replaces it with that, right? So we can see now. So if I do, let's do, and if there is, are spaces in your string, then that's fine. right? This one can be Black Panther. All right, so I've called this function twice, and I've called it with different inputs each time. And I can still call my other one, right? If I call say hello 1, then that one is just going to say hello, right? So we have a very simple example of a function, but it does point out the important syntax things that you have when it comes to a function. You have the keyword function to define it, a name. You should give your function a descriptive name. Function names often have verbs in them because functions are their action pieces of code, right? They do something. So you should give them a verb in the name and make it descriptive. You need to be clear about what its job is. That's usually one of the first comments that I want to write. And then you write the work. And if it's going to have a parameter, then you have to give that parameter a name. And when you call the function, you need to pass data into that parameter. All right. So I think in the next video, we're going to do a little bit with the DOM and show how we can call this function along with a button and some action. So for right now, make sure that you're clear about all the syntax of how to create functions either without any inputs or with an input. We'll end up doing some later on with multiple parameters that are passed to them. And we'll also see that functions can return values at some times. So we'll see that in future videos.